It's been said that the only certainty in life is uncertainty. And unfortunately for us, uncertainty doesn't seem like something that's beneficial. But what if there was a way we could gain from uncertainty? In his book, Antifragile, author Nassim Nicholas Taleb defines something antifragile as something that benefits from things like uncertainty, harm, and disorder. And the story goes something like this. What's the opposite of fragile? I'll give you a second.
A few moments later.
Most people will say something like robust, resilient, tough, tenacious, etc. But think of it like this. Suppose you're sending some very expensive champagne glasses to a good friend in Siberia. Get all the packing material, you put the glasses in there, and you make sure the contents are securely packed and the box is labeled fragile, handle with care. The key thing here is this label of handle with care. What does this imply? This implies things that are fragile don't benefit from variability or disorder or being shaken up. So if things that are fragile don't like change, don't like variability, its opposite should love it. Things like robust, resilient, tough, tenacious, they don't quite fit under this category. Something robust doesn't care if there's variability or stability. Something robust is apathetic toward its environment. In the book Antifragile, Taleb defines the opposite of fragile as antifragile. And this is something that benefits from variability and volatility and all these things that don't typically sound like good things. So these three concepts of fragile, robust, or something like it, and anti-fragile form what Nassim calls a trinity. And there are three stories from Greek mythology which highlight these three concepts. The first story is the Sword of Damocles, which is the story about a servant who sees the life of a king with all his gold, all his power, and wants nothing more to be in his position. And so one day, the servant trades places with the king. And what he soon realizes is that it's not so great being king. Because when you have everything, everyone wants to take your stuff, everyone wants to take your power. And the sword sitting above the king's throne is a symbol for the constant threat you are under when you are in a position of power. So being king is an example of being fragile. Because when you have everything, you have nothing to gain and everything to lose. Any changes in the environment and situation will probably not benefit you. The second story is the story of the phoenix, which is a bird who, when it dies, it rises again from its ashes. And this highlights the concept of robustness. The phoenix doesn't care if it lives in a stable, tranquil environment or in an erratic, constantly changing environment. Because worst case scenario, if the phoenix dies, it'll rise again from its ashes. The phoenix is apathetic toward its situation. And the final story is the story of the Hydra monster, which is the monster that Hercules fought. And whenever he would chop off one of its heads, 3 more would grow in its place. The Hydra is anti-fragile because the more you harm it, the stronger it gets. So when you hear this idea of anti-fragility, and you've spent any time in the real world, which is constantly changing, a natural question is, how can I be anti-fragile? I'll talk about 7 points toward this idea of anti-fragility. So I'll just briefly talk about these 7 points, and I'll leave further exploration and discussion for future blog posts and videos. So the first point is having more upside than downside. Another way to think about this is limiting your losses and leaving your gains unbounded. And really, this is the core idea behind anti-fragility. Nassim gives a more technical definition of anti-fragility and fragility in terms of something called convexity, which I talk a little bit more about in the blog. The second point is having options as opposed to not having options. Or in other words, having a specific and detailed plan. In life, unexpected things inevitably happen. If you sit down and chart out your whole life, your 5-year plan, like this is exactly what my life's gonna be and this is exactly what I'm gonna get out of it, you're setting yourself up for disappointment because, I hate to break it to you, it's probably not gonna happen exactly the way you think right now. So detailed plans and having no options is fragile, while having options helps you be anti-fragile. The third point is bottom-up traditions as opposed to top-down rules. This isn't so much a specific protocol, but is a potentially useful observation. Bottom-up tradition is evolution at work. Things get passed down through generations based on usefulness or some kind of appeal, and then each generation adds their little twist and nuance to it and updates it based on their situation. In other words, traditions can adapt and evolve over time based on the needs of the people that practice them, as opposed to top-down rules which are rigid. It's kind of like having a detailed plan. There's only one way in which the top-down rules typically work, and if things deviate from how they were when the rules were written, they're probably not going to give you the desired outcome. The fourth point will sound kind of silly, but it's failure. Failure makes you anti-fragile, and success makes you fragile. It's just like the king from the Sword of Damocles story. The king is fragile because he's successful. He has nothing to gain and everything to lose. While failure and mistakes help you be anti-fragile. Because when you're a failure, a loser, when you have nothing, no one expects anything from you. You don't expect anything from yourself. So you have a lot more to gain than to lose. Just like when you hit rock bottom. When you hit rock bottom, there's literally nothing to lose and everything to gain. Point number 5 is in a similar vein, and that is staying small as opposed to being big. When you're small, your mistakes are small. But when you're big, your mistakes are big. It's like that old piece of wisdom: mo money, mo problems. The bigger you get, the bigger your problems get. What would have just been a small inconvenience when you're small becomes a significant thing when you're big. So the 6th point is diversification as opposed to specialization. Diversification helps you be anti-fragile. And this is just like having options. When you diversify, you're essentially giving yourself more options. Nassim gives a specific protocol in the book called barbelling, which is kind of like this 80-20 rule. People typically hear it in the context of business, like 20% of your clients earns you 80% of revenue, or just something like that. What Nassim calls barbelling is when you put 80% of your resources in a low-risk situation, while 20% of your resources in a high-risk situation. So a concrete example could be working a 9-to-5 job that pays you a steady salary, which you spend 80% of your time on, but 20% of your time you spend on something more risky, like a new business venture or a side hustle. The problem with specialization is the same problem as having a detailed plan. If something happens, your specialization is no longer needed, and in some ways, you are no longer needed. Or if you put all your eggs in one basket, you just specialize all your assets, you specialize all your resources into one venture, you put all your money into that high-risk side hustle business venture, there's a chance that you're going to lose everything. The 7th point is this idea of independence as opposed to dependence on others. When you're independent, either financially, emotionally, or however you want to look at it, you're setting yourself up to be anti-fragile. While if you're dependent on others for a house, a car, money, a job, a hobby, whatever it is, you're setting yourself up to be fragile. So what this ultimately comes down to is, if you lose access to these external things, to other people or other things, you're going to find yourself in an undesirable situation. Well, if you're self-reliant, you're not dependent on external things, you're independent, you're setting yourself up to be anti-fragile because you're not going to lose. There's no downside to when your environment changes. So as usual, I probably rambled on way too much, so I want to leave you with 3 key takeaways. The first is, something anti-fragile is something that benefits from things like uncertainty, harm, and disorder. The second takeaway is, we can classify things into these 3 categories as fragile, robust, and anti-fragile. And by classifying things into these categories, we can study them and hopefully learn what we should do and should not do based on our goals. The third and final takeaway is, we can do things that make us more anti-fragile, and I highlighted 7 points that can help us on this journey. So there's no way I could have gone into all the details of such a big idea in one video. That's why this video is just part of a larger series of videos and blogs exploring this idea of anti-fragility and trying to answer this question: how can I be more anti-fragile? So if you enjoyed this video, please consider liking, sharing, subscribing, and commenting your thoughts. If you have ideas or answers to this question, how can I be more anti-fragile, please leave that in the comment section. I think others and myself would love and benefit from hearing that. And as always, thanks for watching.